Okay. Okay. Thanks for your patience. Sorry, we're a little bit late starting today. Freida was held up on a train this morning. Just while we're waiting for her to return in a moment, I'll just say a few words about her. She's a Canadian multidisciplinary artist and composer. She's based in London. She teaches at Goldsmiths. Her artistic and research interests revolve around intersensory composition under computational process. She works with fixed reactive audiovisual media for concert diffusion, installation, and large-scale multimedia production, as well as with computer vision techniques and sensor-based technologies. Her music's been compared to Coil and Zoviet France because of her use of spectral manipulation and collage, and it falls between musique concrète and more contemporary noise music. As well as having created visual shows for and performed with Nurse with Wound, she's presented her own sound and visual work at festivals across North America and Europe. And so I will now hand over to Freida.
Is this? I'll just hold it. It'll be fine. You guys can all hear me? To be honest, I can scream loud enough as I talk that you can all hear me, but I'll talk through the microphone if that's helpful. Hi, my name's Freida Abtan. I'm sorry I'm late today. I got stuck on a train. I'm sure that we're all familiar with that particular experience in London. I'm not quite sure what was said in the introduction, so perhaps I'll give my own. All right. I'm a person with a very diverse background, and that's what brought me where I am today. So I thought I'd introduce myself by first saying who I've been. In the 90s, I did a double major in mathematics and computer science, and I was pretty sure that that was the direction my life was going to take. And somehow I started making quite a lot of art. And at that point, working as a computer scientist, I realized that I was wasting my life. And so I quit and went to art school, immediately looking for ways that I could use computer science to make art, since that was the tool set that I had myself. When I started programming computers, I immediately started imagining audio effects, as I'm sure most of you guys like to program audio effects, right? Great hobby. So I found myself in Montreal studying electroacoustic studies and computation arts. And from there, went on to actually study formally composition and later computer music. This doesn't mean that those are my only interests. Right now, I'm teaching at Goldsmiths University of London. The program that I run there is called Music Computing, so it's half music, half computer science. You can see that this is leading somewhere. But actually, as a composer, I feel like my work touches all kinds of things. For starters, my interest in electronic music actually came from experimental stuff, like probably second wave industrial, first wave industrial, stuff that was weirder sound stuff that was descended off that. It really didn't come out of the Western art music tradition, even though that's what I studied. I became very interested in audiovisual composition, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and also multimedia performance, building instruments. There's a lot of pops and clicks on this microphone. Is it okay if I just perhaps talk? All right, we can do that. Electroacoustic and audiovisual improvisation and laptop performance. But of course, as a researcher, there's a lot of different themes that I look at when I'm doing this kind of work. And some of those things have to do with gestural compositional discourse, immersive environments, larger questions about improvisation, right? And these things come up again and again, no matter what kind of work I'm doing. So my background started in studio composition when I was looking at the arts, and I released a few albums. Some people know me because I worked with a band called Nurse with Wound for many years. Started doing their visual shows as well, which sort of led me to a particular place in music. But specifically, as I started writing electronic music, I started getting visual ideas based on the movement that was in that music. So, and that's really what my master's degree was about. This is a still from a piece we're going to see today called The Hands of the Dancer. And this is a piece that's really about looking at physical process through video. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So right now, there's a reason that I'm just going to be flipping through different areas that I've been working with as an artist. And part of that, from a quick conversation I had with John outside, right? Part of that is to show you guys that sometimes the direction you're going to end up in with your artwork might not be obvious at the beginning, because for anybody else looking at the kind of work that I've done over my career, they're going to assume that I have ADD and have no focus whatsoever, no particular single direction, right? But actually, I'm just an interdisciplinary person, and I thrive off those connections, those bigger research questions that you might be able to answer by working between media. Now, I'm mentioning this because as a student, I studied all of these different things, and as an artist, I did all of these different things without realizing that they were going to connect together. And I don't know about you guys, but probably you have lots of interests that you haven't realized yet are actually going to connect together, because we don't really know what fields look like in the future or what kind of work we're going to be able to do, right? If I could have seen the kind of work I do now when I was in, 15 years ago, I wouldn't even have believed it was possible. So it's always worth being true to the things that actually draw your attention. So I got very interested in audiovisual composition. I started working as a performer. This is a still from me several years ago playing at the MUTEC Festival of Electronic Music in Montreal, Canada. You can see that I'm a little face dwarfed by the video here. And that's on purpose, because I don't actually want people to look at me when I'm working with a laptop. There's not all that much they can really see about the motion that I'm trying to convey to them. However, I started to realize that by giving them this kind of immersive experience of video, a lot of the important movement could be accentuated in my music and really show something to the audience that way. I also have a background as an improviser. First, I was doing this primarily with sound. That's a still of me working with members of Nurse with Wound and another band called Current 93. This was a show we did quite a while, actually in Britain, which is, at the time I had flown here from Canada. I'm actually Canadian, in case you didn't figure that out from my accent. And this would have been just, of course, improvising with a laptop. Okay. My improvisation practice started getting me interested in designing new instruments. Have any of you guys worked at all with instrument design? Yeah? Well, I started working just with different sensors and attaching sensors to objects and trying to give some kind of sonification to physics, to physical experiences. And I'm mentioning that you might see a theme already. I mentioned that a lot of the audiovisual composition was working with this kind of manifestation of material and physical states, right? So these threads start to pass through different kinds of work, even with things that might not have seemed related to begin with. Let's see if I can click on this. This is this picture, yeah? Is from an instrument I built quite a while ago called spinning splatters. Can you load it? So the interesting thing about this instrument, I think, isn't the barrage of sounds it makes. Well, it's also the barrage of sounds it makes, because that's obviously the point of the instrument. It's that you can really get some sense of the kind of gestures I'm making with it through the sonification process. And of course, I've written... The nice thing about working with sensors this way is that it's not one sound instrument. So that was a demonstration. We've just seen 3 different sound instruments that actually came from the same controller, right? So that first one gave us a kind of pitch shifting effect, right? That was sonifying the kind of motion of the spinning platter. The second one that we saw was a kind of synthesizer that had something to do with how fast the platter was spinning, and obviously was seated differently every time I touched it. And the third instrument we saw was a kind of scrubbing instrument, probably some kind of granular scrub with the top one. And the nice thing about working with a system like this, of course, is that over time you can remap the sensor values to anything you want. So you don't end up with just one fixed instrument. You end up with an instrument that's kind of sliding over time, where your gestures might give different kinds of contours in your performance. Right. So you can see that this might be the kind of art that somebody with a math and computing background might start to experiment with, because I had the skills, so why not use them? But at the same time, it's a pretty far difference from that kind of still I showed you of the hands of the dancer, right? This doesn't look anything like audiovisual composition. So again, I'm seeing this discrepancy in all the work that I do, and it didn't really come together until I started to think about bigger performance situations. Oops. I should mention that I also worked for a long time doing installations. This is a scene from an installation I did, again, working with this idea of, can we give video a sense of physics? So maybe it's worth us taking a little look of that. So here we can see me trying to heat up the video to give it a sense that it might be able to melt and cling based on where the motion is in the frame, right? Go a little further. Here's another one called Weight, which again is being seated with motion, but treats video like a particle system so that it can be repelled or attracted towards the motion that's being created in the frame. I'm going to stop here, even though there's a few other experiments in this video. Let's go back to the slides. Oops, cancel. Okay. At the same time, as I mentioned, I got very interested in the way sound worked in other situations besides standard music situations. So this is a still from an installation by Janet Cardiff and George Burrs Miller. Are you guys familiar with their work? Yeah. Okay. So I worked for them for quite a few different pieces. This is a piece called The Killing Machine that uses a composition I wrote called Heartstrings, written by sampling a violin and working with it through different kinds of audio methods. Let's go back for a second. And what I love about this piece, and what I loved about working with Janet Cardiff and George Miller, is that this is a piece in which the whole environment is meant to be alive and choreographed together, right? So everything is controlled almost like a mini opera of objects. And the music really sets the motion for how these things are going to work. And in fact, the whole piece was choreographed to the movement in the music. stop that video there. So you can see that this collaboration, obviously, again, working with electronics, working with the motion in music, trying to make that motion tangible, either through animating objects or fundamentally through visual motion, right? So again, common threads across all of this work. My audio design work actually became increasingly computational. So this is a collaboration with an artist named Phoenix Perry, who's a game designer, on a program called Bot Party, in which a collection of small robots it uses capacitive sweeping to find out when they're connected through human touch. Right? And the whole thing becomes a kind of audio exploration game. We just presented this at the Games Developer. We actually were a semi-finalist at the Games Developer Conference this year, showing this project. You can see a couple of people playing with it on the right. And again, this is one of the ways that this kind of complex set of interests between visual motion, audio motion, physics, and programming starts to come alive. There's really a place for this kind of work. But all of this is bringing me somewhere. Specifically, it's bringing me to this idea of multimedia performance. And I'm mentioning this because for a person with a pretty wide collection of interests, it's like an epiphany to realize that all of these things can start to come together in single pieces, right? At no point while I was doing visual work, while I was making music, while I was a programmer, did I think that these were all leading to one practice. But for all of us, the multiple things that we do are who we are, and art doesn't really have the same kind of boundaries between disciplines that we like to pretend when we're studying it. So all of the different things we do can come together in a single piece. This is actually still from an early work called Heartstrings. It's a little bit difficult to see. There's a string quartet there playing by candlelight, and the audience really just sees these very stark black and white projections that are projected over the players. The idea here is that the visuals are completely choreographed with the music. So the performers are actually playing with a click track to make that happen. And again, it's an exploration of audio-visual motion in real space. All right. Let's go back to video music. That was a quick presentation to show you that all of these things do comprise a single practice, I promise. But actually, I'm going to focus today on talking about 3 different pieces, specifically exploring audio-visual motion, and then eventually how, as a performer, I went from showing these fixed works to thinking of real-time scenarios in which they might make a little more sense for a different kind of presentation for the audience. So to start, I thought I would actually show you one of my full works. This is a piece called The Hands of the Dancer. In a lot of ways, this piece was made because of those installation pieces I showed you, asking if video could manifest physics, right? And there's a reason for that. It turns out that there are certain questions in computational aesthetics, or those are some big words. How many of you guys have seen real-time video works? Probably a few of you guys. Well, let me tell you, you guys are the first generation that might think they look good. Because previously they were very, very ugly. And the reason they were very, very ugly is because it was hard to do a lot in real time computationally. So there were tons of artists trying to make these works that had real-time elements, and you'd get this terrible resolution for the part that was in real time, and it would look super grainy, and it just broke the effect completely. So because I was already doing this exploration to try to figure out what I could do that was meaningful in real time, as an artist, I became really useful to see what I could do with those processes aesthetically. And this was my first exploration there. So a lot of it was seeded by this understanding of video as physical process and how I could make real-time effects that would demonstrate that. But let's start with a discussion showing you guys The Hands of the Dancer, actually. So. everybody. So, thank you. So that is the first of the full-length pieces I want to show you today. It's called The Hands of the Dancer, like I said, and it's 10 years old now, if you can imagine it. But in some ways, it's, for me personally, it was probably the most important of my fixed media works. And by watching it, I mean, what do people think that piece is about? I already mentioned that a lot of things inspired by these programming experiments I was doing, examining physical processes in video, right? Did you guys see that? What else did you see? Yeah? No, but I like it. Anyone else? Yeah? I mean, well, thematically, the piece is about lucid dreaming, okay, explicitly. So there's a bunch of bits in there that actually came from dreams I remembered, right? And it's meant to sort of work with this kind of associative logic where characters switch places and things are always in a state of transformation, right? Which quite inspired by physical transformation. And also this experience, there's bits of it that are about what happens when you suddenly like notice your arms, or you suddenly, like, that's a very specific experience for those who've ever done lucid dreaming. Perhaps you're aware of it, perhaps you aren't. The sound world is also very much comes from these experiences of lucid dreaming. The bass, it's really all extreme high frequencies and extreme bass. The bass being like these very personal sounds by, I think I associate close mic'd sounds actually with being beside the body. By the way, I don't suggest to any of you that you ever write your music entirely in the bass and in the high frequencies, because if you play that in a club, you can hear every single person talking right over it. It's kind of amazing. But regardless, what I was hoping somebody would point out is that this piece is really meant to be an attempt at audiovisual composition. It just is not the same thing at all in terms of the movement if you just listen to the sound or you just watch the images. And the whole way through, it's really a series of experiments in how you can change the perception of movement between sound and image, which is one of my favorite topics, really. So as you can imagine, as a performing artist interested in these kinds of, in this kind of like interdisciplinary dialogue of movement, you come up really quickly with a problem in terms of performance, because it takes a quite tight synchronization to make audiovisual gestures. And actually, for most of us, that's not something that we can really think of doing live, especially not in a way that's going to have this kind of visual quality, right? Because as I already mentioned, and especially 10 years ago when I made this piece, you just couldn't get the same kind of resolution in a real-time framework. And so by nature, the real-time video work just looked a little less aesthetically pleasing, right? So what I'd like to do is show you a little bit of the kind of work I'm performing now that sort of descends from this. And then if we have time, I'll show you a little bit of my larger scale multimedia production work. What? Well, conveniently, when I talk about what I'm doing in real time, I'll deconstruct it a bit. I won't deconstruct it with this work, but I'll talk about what inspired it and the theory that inspired it, because all of you guys, as sound artists, I'm interested in showing you the blood and guts, right? The understanding of movement that makes this kind of work happen. So, is it worth showing you that last slide? This, by the way, is the kind of work that I'm touring at the moment. So you can see it's a bit psychedelic. That would be me actually performing The Hands of the Dancer at some festival. I'm not really sure where that image is from. But right now, when I'm performing live, I'm working with a combination of pre-composed audiovisual work and real-time processes that references the same aesthetic that I've already manifested in the sound and the video. And there's a lot of reasons for doing things this way. One reason is just practical. I can get a kind of richness to the sound and the image in pre-composed work that I still can't quite access if I was generating everything live, right? But the other reason is because it allows me to play around with all the P's and B's are killing me here. It allows me to really improvise with the kind of gestures that I might get from dealing with like physical controllers, right? And at the same time, tie them to aesthetic experiences that only come about through a kind of self-similarity. So what happens when I'm already working with a set of processes in the fixed media and have access to a similar set of processes that I can control in real time? That's a picture. This down here, by the way, is just the interface for the real-time system I wrote. It's nothing much. You can see I've just got some models of controllers that I plug in. But basically, I can link all of these to different visual processes that I can control in real time, and at the same time, map them to different sound processes that I can control in real time, if I want to. To be honest, the way that I work with the system is I have sound processes that map to each of the visual processes that I use, and then I decide how much I want to use them, because it turns out that it can be quite overwhelming if all of the visuals are co-joined between sound and image, right? That really changes the dialogue of the work. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of this system and talk a little bit about what audiovisual motion is and what happens with the real-time experience when we're performing this way. Like, what are the different ways that that actually changes the audiovisual dialogue of a piece? By the way, this is the same, almost, I mean, it's not exactly the same frame, but it's almost the same frame of the video in terms of how I would have rendered it without the real-time performance and what happens during the real-time performance. Now, that's just one way that I might have processed it live. You can see that the original video that I'm performing with is already quite heavily processed visually, right? So I'm working with something that I think already looks and sounds quite good, even before I'm improvising with it. And that is something that I do simply because I've been a performer for a long time. And the number one thing you need to do as a performer is always guarantee a certain level of quality, right? You want to have risk in what you're doing, because otherwise there's no point to being there. And yet, I don't want to misrepresent my work. Right? I want to be able to give the audience something that's based around this quite large volume of material I've created. So this is like for me a sweet spot in the middle, where actually I can do quite a lot live to really change what I'm presenting. And yet, even if I wasn't touching it, I would feel proud of it and think it was my work. Okay. Are you guys interested in having me demo this system before I go on to multimedia performance? It's a second piece I'd like to show you today. Yeah, I want some nods or I'm not going to do it. Come on, guys. Okay.